On a quiet street in Charleston, where old bricks remember secrets and silence often protects the cruel, a single splash of water was enough to shatter a young janitor's life. You think you can just know and expect it was a man who stepped out of the crowd, calm as a shadow, carrying a past forged in war, and walking beside a white German shepherd whose eyes missed nothing. Because this was never just about a bully or a broken job. It was about how fear spreads when good people look away, and how quickly the world can change when one person refuses to. And as a fake martial arts master issued a public challenge, believing power came from shouting and control. He had no idea he was awakening something older and far more dangerous. A quiet vow to protect. A truth that would unravel lies, expose corruption, and force an entire community to face what it had tolerated for too long. So stay with me until the end to witness how justice arrives without warning, how courage is born in silence, and how a white canine became the guardian of a new beginning. And if stories of honor, hidden strength, and unexpected justice move your heart, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and comment below to tell us where you're watching from and what this story made you feel. Late October settled over Charleston, South Carolina, like a damp blanket that refused to lift. The air carried the sharp salt of the Atlantic and the faint sweetness of jasmine drifting from hidden courtyards, a smell that clung to the old cobblestone streets, the way memory clings to places that have seen too much. Spanish moss swayed from ancient oak branches, gray and patient, as if the city itself had learned long ago how to watch without intervening. Inside a sleek commercial building tucked between boutiques and cafes, Emily Carter pushed a yellow mop bucket down the hallway, her shoulders aching from a double shift. At 23, she moved with the tired efficiency of someone much older, careful not to draw attention, careful not to make mistakes. Every dollar mattered. Rent was due in days, and her mother's heart medication, lined up on the kitchen counter beside an oxygen tank, was running dangerously low. Emily worked quietly, invisibly, the way people like her were expected to, outside, parked illegally in the loading zone, like a challenge to anyone who might question it, sat a bright red sports car polished to a mirror shine. It belonged to Blake Harrington, owner of the Titanium Fist Martial Arts Dojo next door, a man who treated the street like his personal kingdom. Blake was already in a foul mood, pacing near his car, phone pressed to his ear, complaining loudly about incompetence and disrespect to anyone within earshot. Emily didn't see him at first. One wheel of the mop bucket caught in a crack between the stones. The bucket tipped just enough for a splash of soapy water to arc outward and kiss the rubber of the sports car's front tire. It was nothing, water that would dry in seconds, but the sound of Blake's voice exploded across the street like a gunshot. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he roared. Emily froze. Her heart dropped so hard it felt physical. She turned, eyes wide, hands already lifting in. "Apology. I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident. I'll wipe it right off." Blake stormed toward her, face flushed beneath an artificial tan, veins standing out in his neck. "Do you have any idea how much that car costs?" he shouted, jabbing a finger inches from her face. "You people are all the same. Careless, useless." He slapped the rag out of her hand, sending it into the dirty water pooling near the curb. Emily flinched as if struck. Around them, pedestrians slowed, stared for a heartbeat, then looked away. No one stepped in. No one wanted trouble. "I'll pay for the cleaning," Emily said desperately, tears burning her eyes. "Please." Blake laughed loud and cruel. "With what?" "That pathetic paycheck. I should make you get on your knees and clean it with your tongue." Something inside Emily cracked. Not loudly, not in a way anyone could hear, but deep enough to hurt. In that moment, standing on an American street under a clear afternoon sky, she felt smaller than she ever had, not because of the shouting, but because of the silence around it. And just as Blake opened his mouth to say something worse, a shadow fell across the pavement. Emily looked up. A man had stepped off the curb and into the space between them, tall, calm, dressed simply in jeans and a gray t-shirt. At his left side sat a white German shepherd, still as stone, pale coat glowing against the dark street. Pale eyes locked on Blake with quiet intensity. The man's voice was low, steady, and impossible to ignore. "That's enough," he said, and the air itself seemed to change. The street seemed to hold its breath after the stranger spoke, the humid Charleston air thickening, as if even the ancient brick walls were listening, and Blake Harrington turned slowly, his practiced snarl already forming before his eyes landed on the man standing between him and his prey. A man who did not look impressed, intimidated, or even particularly interested, which irritated Blake far more than anger ever could, because men like Blake survived on reactions, on fear, on the electricity of dominance, and this man offered him none of it, only a steady gaze and a quiet presence that felt immovable, while beside him the white German shepherd sat with flawless discipline, ears forward, body relaxed yet coiled like a drawn bow, not barking, not lunging, simply watching. And Blake felt an unexpected ripple of unease crawl up his spine. "Who the hell are you?" Blake snapped, puffing out his chest, the familiar performance kicking in as pedestrians slowed again, sensing a spectacle. "This doesn't concern you. This girl damaged my property." The man didn't raise his voice, didn't even step closer, yet somehow Blake felt the space shrinking. "It's water," the man said calmly. "You nigher. You're done here." Emily stood frozen behind him, hands trembling, her heart slamming so hard she thought she might pass out because for the first time, someone was standing in front of her instead of looking away. And the fear twisted into something sharper, something dangerous. The fear that if this went wrong, it would be her fault. Blake laughed loudly, a harsh sound meant to reclaim control, but it rang hollow even to his own ears. "You think you can tell me what to do?" He sneered, glancing at the dog, then back at the man. "What is that? Your attack, mutt? You hiding behind a leash?" At the word mutt, the German shepherd rose smoothly to all fours and let out a single low growl, deep and controlled, a sound that vibrated to the pavement rather than the air, and Blake instinctively took a step back before catching himself, his face flushing with humiliation as a few people nearby murmured, phones lifting just slightly. "Control your dog," Blake barked, his voice cracking despite himself. The man rested a hand lightly on the dog's neck, not restraining him, simply reminding him of a shared understanding. "He's under control," the man said, his tone unchanged. "Unlike you." The words landed harder than a shove, and Blake felt the eyes of the street turning on him, curiosity, shifting toward judgment, and panic flared beneath his arrogance because bullies could sense when the tide was turning, and Blake needed to flip it back fast. He stepped forward, lowering his voice into a theatrical snarl meant for an audience. "You want to play hero?" he said. "Fine. Come to my dojo tomorrow, noon. You step onto my mat without the dog, and we'll see how tough you are, man to man." Emily's breath caught, her stomach dropping as she realized what Blake was doing, dragging the stranger into his world, where he held the power, where he could hurt someone without consequences. The man studied Blake for a long moment, eyes unreadable, as if weighing more than the challenge, weighing what would happen if he walked away. And Emily felt a sudden terror that he would, that this brief spark of hope would vanish like everything else. Then the man gave a small nod, almost bored. "I'll be there," he said. Blake grinned triumphantly, mistaking calm for weakness, and shouted after them as the man turned away, insults spilling freely now that he believed he'd regained control. But the man didn't look back, and the white German shepherd walked at his side like a silent promise, while behind him Emily stood shaking, staring at their retreating figures, knowing with absolute certainty that something irreversible had just been set in motion. Blake Harrington did not calm down after the crowd dispersed, because humiliation for a man like him did not fade. It fermented, turning into something sour and dangerous. And within minutes of Jack Walker and the white German shepherd disappearing down the street, Blake stormed into the marble lobby of the office building with the same entitlement he carried everywhere. His footsteps sharp and aggressive as he shoved open the door to the property management office without knocking, startling Richard Moore behind his desk, a man whose tie was always a little too tight and whose spine bent easily under pressure. And Blake leaned over him, lowering his voice into a hiss that vibrated with threat, demanding consequences, demanding blood in the form of a young woman's livelihood, painting himself as a victim, claiming damage, disrespect, and liability. Words chosen carefully to terrify a man who feared lawsuits more than injustice. And Richard Moore nodded before his conscience could catch up, dialing a number with shaking fingers, ending a job in less than 10 minutes because fear was faster than fairness. Emily Carter heard the verdict. Standing in a narrow hallway that smelled of bleach and old carpet, her mop bucket still beside her like an accusation. And when Richard told her she was terminated, effective immediately, no severance, no discussion, her ears rang as if the building itself had gone underwater, her mouth opening to speak, but producing no sound. Because there were moments when shock steals language, and she walked out carrying a small cardboard box with her name written in marker, the weight of it absurdly light compared to the weight crushing her chest. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, clouds rolling in from the harbor like an omen, and Emily collapsed onto a cold metal bench at a bus stop, clutching the box to her ribs as if it might hold her together, her thoughts spiraling fast and merciless. Rent due on Tuesday, $40 left in. Her wallet, her mother's oxygen tank already half empty, the pharmacy warning echoing in her mind that refills didn't wait for miracles, and the most terrifying thought of all slipped in quietly, that maybe the world would be better off without her struggling inside it. She pressed her palms to her eyes, breathing hard, when a shadow fell across the pavement again, and she looked up to see Jack Walker standing a respectful distance away, the white German shepherd sitting calmly at his heel, the dog's pail for catching the streetlight, like a quiet signal of safety. And something inside Emily broke loose as tears spilled freely, her shame burning hotter than her fear, as she admitted she'd been fired, admitted she had nowhere to go, admitted the truth about her mother's failing heart and the impossible math of survival. And Jack listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening, not with rage, but with resolve, because he had seen this kind of damage before, not caused by bombs or bullets, but by men who use power to suffocate others slowly. And when Emily whispered that she felt like a burden, Jack spoke at last, his voice steady enough to anchor her, telling her she wasn't weak, she was targeted, and that mattered, promising her she would not lose her home, her mother would not go without medicine, and Blake Harrington would not walk away from what he'd done. And as thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, Jack made a quiet decision that felt heavier than any fight, because tomorrow was no longer about pride or challenges. It was about making sure a bully learned what real consequences felt like. Jack Walker did not sleep much that night, because old habits from another life rose quietly to the surface. And by sunrise, he was already moving through Charleston with Ghost at his side, reading the city the way some men read scripture, noticing who watched, who turned away, and which corners felt wrong. And the first stop was a narrow diner wedged between two brick buildings, a place that smelled of burnt coffee and stubborn survival, with a man behind a counter, a gay-haired veteran named Frank Reynolds, looked up once at Ghost and then at Jack, and nodded without a word, recognizing discipline when he saw it. And over chipped mugs, Frank spoke in a low voice about Blake Harrington, about protection fees disguised as neighborhood security, about shop owners who paid because broken windows cost more than silence, about parents locked into long martial arts contracts they couldn't afford. And as Frank talked, Jack felt a cold clarity settle in, because this wasn't a single act of cruelty. It was a pattern, a system built to crush people slowly while calling itself respectable. After leaving the diner, Jack circled the titanium fist dojo from a distance, pretending to be just another passerby. But Ghost's posture shifted the moment they reached the alley behind the building, the white shepherd's ears rising, body stiffening as a strange metallic scent mixed with chemicals drifted from stacked crates near a reinforced door. And Jack knelt to examine the labels, supplements, performance enhancers, cash-only deliveries from shell companies that didn't exist on any legitimate registry. And his pulse quickened not with fear, but recognition, because he had seen this before in places far from home. Businesses laundering money and ego under the cover of community service. Jack retreated quietly and headed for the public library, its tall windows glowing with morning light, where he sat at a computer terminal and began digging, name after name, license after license, until the truth surfaced like a body breaking water. A disciplinary record buried deep in a national martial arts database. Blake Harrington, permanently expelled years ago for falsifying ranks and defrauding students. His title stripped, his authority revoked, and Jack printed the document slowly, each page sliding out with a soft mechanical hum that sounded final, folding the papers carefully and tucking them inside his jacket, as if they were evidence and a promise all at once. Outside, the city moved on unaware, tourists laughing, traffic flowing. But Jack felt the tension tightening, because now the fight had teeth. And Blake Harrington was no longer just a bully with a loud mouth. He was a fraud standing on a collapsing platform. And frauds were most dangerous when cornered. As Jack walked back toward the street where it all began, Ghost paced perfectly to the side, white for a bright against a darkening sky. And Jack knew the challenge tomorrow was no longer about stepping onto a mat. It was about pulling a mask off in front of everyone who had been afraid to look. And for the first time since Charleston, the city itself seemed to lean in, waiting to see whether truth would finally be louder than fear. Night fell over Charleston with deceptive calm, the kind that softened edges and made danger feel distant. And inside a modest roadside hotel, Jack Walker prepared the way he always did when something felt wrong. Not with panic, but with precision, checking the lock twice, sliding a rubber door wedge into place, placing his bag where he could reach it without thinking, while Ghost lay near the foot of the bed, white fur dimmed by lamplight, eyes half closed but senses fully awake. Because rest for a working dog was never sleep. It was readiness. Hours passed. Traffic noise thinning to the occasional hiss of tires on damp pavement. And just as Jack allowed himself a slow breath, Ghost's head snapped up, ears stiff, a low vibration rolling from his chest like distant thunder. And Jack was moving before conscious thought caught up, rolling off the bed and into the shadow beside the door. One hand lifted in a silent signal, because the sound that followed was unmistakable. Metal scraping softly, a lock being tested by hands that did not belong there. The door handle twitched, paused, then the deadbolt clicked, and for a heartbeat, nothing happened. As if the night itself was deciding whether to cross a line. And then the door slammed inward with a dull crack as the wedge skidded across the floor. Two figures bursting inside, one tall and broad with bat wrapped in tape, the other wiry and twitchy, gripping a heavy wrench, their confidence loud and clumsy, fueled by the belief that they were hunting a man alone. They never saw a ghost launch. The white German Shepherd moved like a living blur, striking center mass with a force that knocked the bigger intruder backward into the wall, the bat clattering uselessly to the floor as Ghost pinned him, teeth bared inches from his throat. A silent promise of consequences. The second man swung wildly, fear overtaking intent. But Jack stepped inside the arc of the wrench, controlled the wrist, and dropped him to the carpet, practiced efficiency, pinning him without wasted motion, his voice calm and terrifyingly steady as he ordered him to stay down. The room fell into chaos and then into silence just as quickly, broken only by panic breathing and the hum of the air conditioner. And when Jack gave a command, Ghost released instantly and returned to heel, sitting straight, tongue flicking once, as if the encounter had been nothing more than an interrupted drill. When the lights came on, the intruders looked around in dawning horror, realizing they had broken into the wrong room. And when Jack asked who sent them, the answer came fast and sloppy, a name spoken with resentment and fear. Blake Harrington cash payment instructions to make sure Jack couldn't show up tomorrow. Jack felt no satisfaction, only confirmation, and when the police arrived minutes later, lights flashing blue across the curtains. Jack requested something unusual, asking that the arrest stay quiet until afternoon, explaining calmly that arrogance would keep Blake exactly where he wanted him, on that mat, believing he was still in control. After the officers left with the shaken men, Jack reset the door and finally sat on the edge of bed, Ghost pressing his weight against Jack's leg, grounding him. And in that quiet aftermath, Jack knew the line had been crossed completely because the challenge was no longer theoretical. The stakes were real, and tomorrow would not just expose a bully. It would end him publicly, permanently, and without mercy. By noon, the Titanium Fist dojo pulsed with nervous energy, the air thick with sweat, cheap disinfectant, and anticipation. Parents lining the mirrored walls with forced smiles while students whispered, sensing that something was wrong before it became visible. And Blake Harrington fed on it, pacing the mat in a custom gi, soaking in attention like oxygen, convincing himself that today would seal his dominance, that public humiliation would turn into public worship once more until the front doors opened without music or announcement. And Jack Walker stepped inside, dressed plainly, unremarkable at first glance, yet carrying a presence that pressed the noise out of the room. while Ghost followed and took his place at the corner of the mat, sitting perfectly still, white fur bright against the dark floor like a boundary no one dared cross. Blake scoffed loudly, masking a flicker of unease, throwing insults meant to draw anger. But Jack gave him nothing, not a word, not a glance, just calm eyes that watched everything. And that calm unsettled Blake more than any threat ever could, because rage could be manipulated, but silence could not. The challenge was called. The crowd leaned forward, and Blake attacked first in a flurry of dramatic kicks and punches, each one loud and fast and designed to impress. But Jack moved with economy, stepping aside, redirecting, letting momentum burn itself out. And with every missed strike, Blake's breathing grew harsher, his confidence leaking away in front of the very people he had built his identity on. The tension spiked when Blake rushed again, overcommitting, swinging wild with frustration, and Jack stopped retreating, standing his ground, eyes sharp, reading the pattern, waiting. And when the opening came, it was decisive. A swift shift of weight, a controlled grip, a seamless takedown that slammed Blake onto the mat in stunned silence, the sound echoing through the room like a verdict. Blake thrashed, shocked more than hurt, scrambling to recover, but Jack stayed close, not striking, not showboating, simply applying pressure where leverage mattered. And for the first time, Blake felt something he had never known on his own mat: complete helplessness. The realization that no amount of shouting could change the physics of truth. Panic set in as parents gasped. Students stared and the mask cracked fully, Blake's voice breaking as he begged, tapping out frantically, his dominance collapsing into desperation in seconds. Jack released him and stepped back immediately, refusing to linger, refusing to humiliate him further with theatrics, because the point had never been pain. It was exposure. And Ghost rose at Jack's signal, barking once, sharp and final, a punctuation mark that sent a shiver through the room. As Blake lay on the mat, breathing hard, staring at the ceiling he once ruled beneath, Jack knew the real blow was still coming, because a fallen bully could still lie, could still manipulate unless the truth was spoken aloud. And as murmurs spread and eyes searched for answers, Jack turned toward his bag, ready to finish what had started. While Blake realized too late that this fight was never about fists, it was about everything it built on: fear. And that foundation was already crumbling under the weight of the crowd's awakening silence. The room did not erupt after the fight. It went still, the kind of stillness that presses against the ears and forces truth to surface. And Jack Walker used that silence like a lever, signaling Ghost with a soft command. The white German shepherd rising and padding across the mat to retrieve a worn leather folder from Jack's bag, returning with it, held carefully in his jaws, as if he understood the weight of what it carried. And Blake Harrington watched with growing dread, pushing himself upright, sweat streaking his face, still trying to find words that might stitch his authority back together. But Jack gave him none of that space, opening the folder and holding the papers high, so the parents along the walls could see the official seals, the letterheads, the signatures that did not lie. And as Jack spoke, his voice calm and unyielding, the story of Blake's past unraveled in public, the permanent expulsion from the National Martial Arts Association, the revoked rank, the documented fraud, each sentence landing heavier than the last, because every parent recognized their own signatures on the contracts Blake had forced on them. Every shop owner felt the remembered pressure of protection fees, and Blake's denials grew shrill and desperate, cracking into something almost pitiful. As the crowd's murmurs turned into outrage, the tension spiked when Blake tried to retreat toward his office, eyes wild, calculating escape. But the doors opened instead, revealing uniformed officers and Chief Thomas Green stepping forward with a warrant in hand. The weight of law entered the room like a storm front, and Blake froze, the reality finally cutting to the lies, his wrists pulled behind his back as the cuffs closed with sound that echoed louder than any cheer. And in that moment, the dojo felt smaller, stripped of its illusion, walls reflecting not power, but shame. Jack raised a hand, stopping the officers just long enough to call Emily Carter forward, and she stepped on the mat slowly, heart pounding, every instinct screaming to shrink. Yet she stood taller than she ever had, looking at the man who had tried to erase her with words. And when she spoke, it was not with anger, but clarity, telling him she felt sorry for him, because he would have to live with himself long after the noise faded. And that quiet sentence struck harder than the takedown, draining what little strength Blake had left as he was led away. The aftermath unfolded quickly. Refunds promised, charges read, parents holding their children closer. And as the building emptied, sunlight poured through the front windows for the first time in years, illuminating dust and truth alike. And days later, the black sign came down, revealing red brick beneath a neighborhood breathing easier without knowing exactly why. Jack stood across the street at dusk with Ghost seated at his side, watching workers erase the last trace of Blake's name. And though no one applauded, no one carved a plaque, Jack felt the quiet satisfaction of mission completed, because justice had been restored not through spectacle, but through exposure. And as he turned to leave Charleston behind, Ghost rose and followed, white fur glowing in the fading light. And somewhere behind them, Emily returned to work with her head high and her mother's medicine secured. Proof that sometimes the strongest battles are fought without hatred, and the greatest victories are the ones that give someone else their life back. After the storms passed and the noise finally settled, life in Charleston quietly turned a page. For Emily Carter, the young janitor once crushed by fear and silence, the world no longer felt like a place designed to erase her. She returned to her work with her head held higher, her mother's medicine secured, her steps lighter, carrying the hard-earned knowledge that dignity could survive even the cruelest moments. For Jack Walker, the Navy SEAL who never sought recognition, this was not a victory to celebrate, but a burden laid down. Reminder that protecting the homeland was not only about distant battlefields, but about standing firm when injustice tried to pass as normal. And for Ghost, the white German shepherd who watched it all in silence, every sunrise now meant another day of calm earned through loyalty and restraint. No longer poised for conflict, but ready as always to guard what matters. Their paths crossed only briefly, yet each life was altered forever, opening into a new chapter shaped not by fear, but by truth and quiet strength. Let us wish peace for the dog who stood watch without a word, and for the people who found their courage when they needed it most. If this story touched your heart, please like and follow for more thrilling and heartfelt stories too.